So for the beginning of the installation phase of this project, I'm back underneath the car and I got done cleaning off the dirt from components like my transmission and the oil pan and some of the suspension parts, but I pretty much got done the cleaning that I wanted to do, and as much as I could within a reasonable amount. So the first step of the installation of this kit will be installing these O2 wire extenders or extensions and that ABS harness wire extension as well. You can see this wire here I've already attached the O2 to, and I just disconnected the O2 from the car and then added that extension on the end there. There's the other O2 extension, and there's the ABS harness wire. Not much to it. Just be careful when you're taking the O2s off. You don't want to damage any of the wire or the clip that holds it on. The shorter extension will be for your passenger side, and the longer extension will be for your drivers. That's also included in the SLP instructions too, just in case you guys happen to forget that part. But next I'll show you where the ABS harness wire will go, or more like how it will be routed in the area that it goes to. And don't forget the zip ties. If you're doing this, don't forget the zip ties that SLP provides you. I've got the instructions with me just to remind myself how all of this gets looped through here. This is probably one of the more confusing parts of this project, but it's really not that difficult. I jumped a little ahead for the sake of showing you guys what I did with my new O2 wiring harness extensions. So I went ahead and installed the exhaust manifolds on both sides, and you don't necessarily have to torque them down, but since I have them up there, I went ahead and torqued the bolts. So the manifolds are currently completely torqued, properly torqued to the heads to about 20 inch-pounds per the instructions, roughly 20. Anyway, so our passenger side got the short extension and our driver's side got the long. I kept the passenger side plug-in, factory plug-in, in its original spot up there on top of the cross member, pin to the cross member, and the driver's is also in its original location. There it is with the blue pin on it. But for the passenger side, the SLP instructions actually called for the O2 extension to be wired through the motor mount, but I thought that was kind of strange because the O2 sensor is actually in a bundle with the starter generator wire, also a ground wire that goes to the starter, and an oil sensor wire as well. And just to route the O2, or even just the O2 and the starter generator together through the mount without twisting and making a big mess of the other wires, I just kept the O2 in its original spot. I think the only reason they suggested that is so the O2 wire won't get damaged by the heat from the header, but I really don't think that's any concern with how it's in position now. So with the extension added, you can kind of see that I actually had to tie back. I did a loop of the slack because I didn't like how low it was hanging on the car. So I took the slack out, bundled it up a little bit, and I actually used one of the zip ties provided by the SLP kit and zip tied the slack together so it wouldn't hang. And if you do this, just make sure that the slack isn't touching anything that won't chafe anything when it's undergoing vibration, and it's not smacked up against the transmission or the oil pan, which might get a little hot during normal operation. But so here's looking up on the passenger side header, and you can see that there's a decent amount of space there, and like I said, I don't understand why they wanted the O2 wired through the motor mount, because you can see how far away that black wire
loop is underneath this header. There's probably almost a whole inch. So I decided to keep it pinned in its original spot instead of trying to reroute it through the motor mount, which is a little far forward. See if we can get a shot of it. Not really, but just a little more forward than the O2 is. There it is, that black bracket right there. That opening right there is where they said to route the wiring, but I disagreed with that, just for the sake of making things simple, and I don't see any damage coming to my wires the way that I have them routed. Like I said, there's that clearance again, so no reason to go through the motor mount, at least for me. And when it comes to the ABS extension, let's see if I can get another shot of that for you guys. Okay, so here's that ABS harness wire extension that was included in the kit, and I didn't even put it on for kind of the same reason. They provide that extension because the ABS harness, sorry, fighting to get some light in here, tight spaces. Anyway, so that wire there, so there's our thick black wire bundle for the starter, for the O2 and all the other little things, but that smaller wire just to the right of it is for the ABS control, and you can see it comes straight down from up top, comes down, and then does a 90-degree turn right into the wheel well or towards the tire, and the connector that ABS harness extender goes into is just behind that wall right there. So I didn't really understand why they included that extension either. Once again, they suggested not only all that O2 and starter generator, or the starter wiring go through the motor mount, they also suggested having the ABS line go through that motor mount too. So if the concern is heat damaging the wires, I don't know why they would have you pass this wire that's already pretty much avoiding the header itself. Why they would have you pass it in front of the header, through this motor mount, back across the header, just to go into the same damn spot that it's in right now. So that's why I left the ABS harness extension out. I mean, I'm going to keep it, I'm not going to toss it, but once again, I didn't really understand their reason for that. Now, the driver's side was much easier to understand in that. Okay, so the driver's side got our long O2 extension, right? And I actually did get it through the motor mount. Yep, there's the motor mount right there, to the engine, to the side of the car. There's the opening for it. Okay, so there's the original plug-in location for the O2 next to the motor. Got it going up through the motor mount, coming out of the top of the motor mount. There's that wire going straight across like that, and then it comes back towards us, and then there's a factory heat shield that should already be on the car. And before installing these headers, this transmission line right here should actually be going through that heat shield already. So there is an open space for that the wiring to pass underneath. So anyway, we've got it, like I said, plugged into the front, through the motor mount, up through the motor mount. There it is right there, coming out, comes up, goes underneath this heat shield. You can see the space in between. And next to that transmission line, not rubbing up against it, but just near it, I've got there's the O2 wire sticking out of the back of the heat shield. So, kind of in the front corner over there by the wheel, comes in and comes out in the back corner right here by the transmission. And then that just hangs down, and there's our O2 plugged into its position on the new manifold. Just watch this space right here. in between the O2 and the transmission. I have not tightened either of these O2s up, so once I get these kind of generally torqued down, I'm going to come back down here and make sure that that clearance right there in between the wire and the transmission is good, because once again, I don't want it to chafe, and I also don't want that wire to get too hot. I mean, it is an O2 sensor, so it's going to be temperature tolerant, but I don't want it to experience any damage that's unnecessary.
Now we're back up top for some tips on how to get the exhaust manifolds up in their position. I personally got the manifolds on the block first prior to doing my O2 extension wiring routing. I just needed to see how the headers would sit, you know, kind of a simulated position of how they would sit on the motor before I would do the wiring, as I've already shown you guys. You don't need to put the headers on first to do the wiring. That's just how I did it. If you can do the wiring first, go ahead. It may actually be easier. I just found this to be the simplest way. Either way, whether you did the wiring first or you put the headers on first, then you did the wiring, when it comes to the header install, this was probably the most frustrating stage of this project so far from me at this point, because the SOP instructions call for both sides to just, you know, naturally slide up in there. Obviously it's a tight fit, but you know, I thought with a little wiggle room that they'd easily go up there. What I thought was kind of crazy was that the passenger side with less room over there, the passenger side with less room actually went up easier than the driver's. And on the driver's side, like I said in the SLP instructions, they just call for this piece just to slide right up in there. Now obviously our factory manifolds came out through the bottom during our disassembly, so the new SLP headers have to go in place from the bottom, so they'll come up from the bottom to get in place. And do not try to put them from top down, because the 3-inch collector on the bottom is just too big to go around this ABS line, the fuel line, and there's some, you know, AC lines over there on the passenger side. Do not try to put these headers on from the top. You have to go through the bottom. So being that the bottom was the easier route, I got to the driver's side. I put the passengers on first because it was so much easier than the driver's. But when I got to the driver's, I tried slipping it up, and I really didn't want to nick my manifold, and I didn't want to beat it up. So, I mean, call me a perfectionist, but I just wanted to keep it in good shape. So to not scratch it, I really had a hard time trying to get around all the awkward angles and components that are hanging out down here, especially the front part of the transmission and the motor mount, and even just the side of the block. I mean, it was just really difficult to get up here, and I was frustrated to find that the only way I could get it up in, you know, get the header up in this position was to take the steering linkage off. You can see that there it is, shaft with a hole in it. Goes into the firewall towards the steering wheel, and then the bottom down there. See if I can get some light on it. That round piece down there, that greased up round piece at the end of my flashlight there, there's the receiving end of the steering shaft, and the steering shaft's in 3 pieces. Now I really didn't want to take this steering shaft off because I've heard that it's a total pain in the ass. But I ended up doing it because that was literally the only way I could get, especially this front tube on the header that goes into cylinder number 1. Anyway, the front tube on the header that goes in the forwardmost cylinder could not fit around the damn steering linkage. So I had to take the steering linkage off, and here it is right here. Like I said, it's a 3-piece. There's the first, there's the center, and there's the third, and there's 2 U-joints on it, which pretty much have stamped couplings in place. You're not getting that out on either end. And on the top side, you'll have a bolt going through kind of a Y fork style coupler that will go through that opening right there on the top of the shaft. And the bottom is the tricky part, because the bottom is almost like a C-clamp, in that this will bite down on that shaft on the bottom. And this bottom bolt, the one that goes on obviously the bottom, this bottom bolt, I fought and fought and fought to get out. I ended up coating it in some, you know, anti-seize oil solution and trying to do everything I could to free it up, because it was just, I fought it the entire way out, and I'm surprised that I actually didn't round it off, even being as careful as I have. But this was kind of a, you know, generally tough piece to take out without moving everything else around it. So this right here has probably caused me to pull the most, you know, all the hair that I've pulled out over this project has been over this piece right here. And before you take this out, here's another interesting point. Before you take this out, make sure you reference its location in the car and remember how it came out. Remember how it went in, how it came out. Just remember its position, because you don't want to screw this up, because you could actually cause a problem with your airbag system if anything turns, or if anything is put back together in the wrong spot, or your steering just could be sloppy. So what I did was I took some photographs and made sure that I remembered exactly how this went in, and I'll be interested to see how easy that bottom C-clamp style, not even really, I'm sorry, here it is, not even really a C-clamp, it's just two jaws that squeeze down on that bottom spindle. I'll be interested to see how difficult that is going in, but I went ahead and cleaned those threads up, just like I've cleaned all the stud bolts, the threads on the studs. Clean those threads up before I put it back in there. Here we are on the passenger side, which ironically fit in easier than the drivers did, because unlike the drivers, you don't have some annoying steering knuckle to take out of the way. There's not a lot of room to move around in over here, but you don't need to take anything out. This passenger header should just slip right up on in. The only concern that I have with the passenger side for this installation is that our starter wire and our ABS wire, those two right there, the starter wire being the thicker one closer to the shot and the smaller ABS in the back, come really close with the header downpipes in how I had them routed. Now maybe if I would have followed the SLP instructions to the T and routed the starter wire and the ABS wire through the motor mount down there, they would have came forward and gone in between these two downpipes, and they might have gotten a little more room, but I would have needed to take the starter wire off, the ground wire off, the oil sensing wire off, the O2 would have to be rerouted, and I really don't see the gain of it, but maybe that could be a way to get some more clearance in between those wires and the downpipe. Just make sure that your wires and your downpipes are not coming in contact with each other, because obviously this exhaust is going to get hot and you don't want to damage the wire, even though the wire is in that shiny chrome-like heat shielding. And I think to myself, if I wouldn't touch this exhaust when the car's at operating temperature, I don't want electrical plastic wiring touching exhaust when the car's at operating temperature. So try and give yourself as much space in between the wiring and the downpipes as possible. I mean, it's kind of hard to see from this angle, but the starter wire, the thick starter wire, actually does have space in between it and the downpipe. And you can't really do much with the starter wire, at least I can't the way I have it routed. If you can move your wiring on the top side or the bottom side to give yourself more clearance, you know, go for it. Just make sure that you're not tugging the wire and damaging it, or you're putting the wire somewhere where it'll chafe or get damaged by something else. With the ABS wire, there actually was a little more wiggle room to play with. I started by moving it back towards the firewall, towards the back of the block, and that gave it some room. But also on the top side, I followed it up all the way next to the computer here, and here's the wire itself. Here's the ABS wire itself, and it was originally butted up against right up against the top of the wheel well here, but I used an SLP supplied zip tie to zip tie it to this other wire bundle that's already attached to the computer, and it's into that first clip on top of the computer. So I ran the zip tie through the clip over both wire bundles, and by pulling this back away from the top of the wheel well, it came up from down there as well. So by pulling it back away, you know, towards the fender of the car, towards the outside of the car, I actually bought myself some space down there. So that's kind of what I suggest if you've been doing everything exactly how I've been doing it. And when you put your headers on, if you haven't torqued them already, just be sure that you torque your bolts properly to the proper spec. I use 20 inch-pounds for all bolts on both sides, and make sure that you put your gasket on the right way. The supplied gaskets actually are labeled manifold size, so make sure you pay attention to that. And the torque sequence for the header bolts that go into the block, start in the middle and then work your way out, and do that maybe two or three sequences just to make sure that you got everything even and firm. Now at this point, I've got both manifolds pretty much torqued down to spec. Everything's in place. I also have my steering knuckle shaft piece back on as well, and that'll take some fighting. Can't really get a good look at it on the bottom, but just if you did take this off like I did, be sure that you seat the bottom completely. I started by putting on the bottom first and sliding it all the way down, and I kind of had to, give it some elbow grease to get it down there. Just make sure that you have it sitting as far down as possible, while also leaving enough of a bolt hole for that bolt to go through. It's not a bad idea to have somebody help you on that task, but make sure you have the bottom pulled all the way down, because you don't want that bottom to slip off the top of that shaft down there. Yeah, pull as far as you can down, and make sure you leave enough space for that bolt to go through, and then just torque them down. I got them pretty firm. I didn't crank them until they snapped, but I got them pretty firm on there to make sure they just don't slip. There is kind of a keyed groove, or I'm sorry, not a keyed groove, but a shaved surface on the bottom to prevent it from slipping, but that didn't stop me from giving that bolt, a few extra turns. But now that the manifolds were on, I went ahead and put my plugs in as well. See one of the tips down there, right there. All the plugs are in, and they're torqued too. And what I do for plugs is I get them to where they're firm. When you're turning them with the ratchet with the 5/8, get them to where they're firm, and then give them a quarter turn. You don't want to get them in there too tight, because that may damage them, or that'll be a pain in the ass when you go to get them back out in the future if you ever have to change plugs again. And you can also notice, because it's in our way, is I put the AIR tubes back on, or air tubes, whatever you want to call them. They're on both sides with the supplied SLP gasket, and the 4 washers are obviously between the bolt and the tube flange. So I used the 4 provided washers and the 2 provided gaskets to get the AIR tubes back on. The oil dipstick tube is back on all the way. Now this I definitely recommend having somebody help you with, because you'll need to route it through your wiring, however you decided to do that when you're putting the headers on. Make sure it goes through the wiring just like everything else. Make sure it's not, rubbing up against anything or poking anything. Then make sure it seats down in the pan. You should kind of feel it click into place. And then the bolt that's holding this filler neck to the head, make sure that bolt's back in place. Use your 15mm socket to get that bolt back in, but have somebody help you with this. It made it a lot easier for me. So now that both manifolds are on and torqued, all the plugs are on and torqued, my air tubes or AIR tubes are also on and torqued in the same way I torqued the steering column. Like I said, just get it firm and maybe give it a quarter turn or a half turn, not too much. You don't want to damage the hardware. But so manifolds on, plugs in, steering knuckle on, AIR tubes on, torqued, and the oil dipstick tube on, and its single 15mm bolt is torqued. All I have to do top side up here for the header install is to put my ignition wires back on, those ignition leads back on from the coil pack end here down to their respective plugs. And then after that, that should be everything on the top side of the motor. Should be everything done, and then I'll make my way underneath the car and finish the Y pipe and new cat installation. I should have said new Y pipe and new cat installation on the bottom. I still haven't changed out my coolant or oil or power steering at this point, but like I said earlier, you don't have to change fluids. That isn't necessary for this project, but that's why my battery's still out, because I'm going to pull that tank out right there. Anyway, so at this stage, if you're like me now, you should just have the ignition wires to go on, and then after that, you can go back under the car and finish the piping underneath, and that should be it. We should be getting close to turning the key on this thing and finally getting a feel and a sound of what this kit can do for this car. One last comment before you head to the bottom of the car to finish up the Y pipe and the cat installation. Just make sure all your miscellaneous pieces have been reconnected. I know that's kind of a obvious statement, but like that little connector that I took out in the very beginning, even before the plug wires, I just about forgot it, but make sure you have all your odds and ends stuff. So I got my little connector back in there, and when you're putting the plugs back in, make sure that not only the bottom of the wire but the top of the wire as well click into place. You'll feel it, and you'll hear it too if you're working in a little bit of silence, but just make sure that they click on both ends so that you won't have anything coming apart when the car's running, or that won't vibrate off, or you just won't get a faulty spark going on. So make sure all of your ignition wires are popped in, but the top and the bottom. The passenger side is obviously going to be another just as much of a problem as it was during the disassembly. I ended up actually taking the AIR tube off the passenger side back off in order to get all the wires in. You can probably get away without doing that, but that's just what I did. So just, it doesn't hurt to look over everything twice. Make sure you have everything reconnected and in its rightful place before you move to the bottom of the car. And if you see anything, cleanliness-wise that needs to be taken care of, clean it again, especially the downpipes on the headers, because you don't want to get the oil from your hands all over these shiny new downpipes and then start the car and then have the heat from the car bake it into the surface of the headers. Sometimes it's worse on other headers, non-coated, but yeah, just make sure you get the downpipes clean on both sides the best you can. Get a rag down there, maybe some solvent, and clean off your downpipes before you put engine heat to them. So double check everything, clean if you have to, and you should be good to go down below the car for hopefully the last time. Here I am in the final stages of this installation, and came back down after getting all the motor components in and done, getting all the little stuff on the motor put back together. First thing I did down here, the final stage, was I used my degreaser or solvent or whatever you may have. I have degreaser myself, but I used my degreaser and wiped the downpipes off again with a soft cloth. I also wiped the outside of the O2 sensors off, double checked my wiring, making sure nothing's getting obstructed or damaged or chafed or anything like that. And then after I got the pipes cleaned up and everything checked, I went ahead and screwed my forward two O2 sensors that have the extensions on them. There's the drivers, there's the passengers. Got them nice and snug. Be careful with them, just like before. They're really delicate, so don't over torque them, just like everything else. I went ahead and slid the SLP high flow race spec cats, whatever you want to call them. But so the SLP high performance cats are on, and I went ahead and put the band clamps on between the cat and the long tubes on both sides. I have not tightened that band clamp. I just got it on there kind of firm, because you're going to want to leave these loose if you're doing this, so when you put the Y pipe on, you can wiggle the Y pipe a little more, and also
to just check the alignment of the entire exhaust system. So I suggest leaving the clamps first before you have everything put on. But so the clamps are on, cats are on, everything forward of the cats have been wiped off, so next should be the Y pipe. Okay, here's the final step of the install. Got all the pipes in and put together. Everything is joined. Car's sitting a little lower now because I have it off the back ramps, so now the rear tires are resting on the floor. But all the pipes are together in the orientation they need to be. All the band clamps are on. And the important thing here is to move all the pipes and the cats in the way they need to go in order to get your rear tips straightened out and your muffler straight. I actually ended up using a pipe expander on the new Y to factory back pipe in order to make it fit correctly. If you do that, just be careful. You don't want to overstress it and crack the old metal by putting the expander on there. But just make sure you have everything sleeved on pretty much the whole way. You don't want anything loose. And when you put your band clamps on, make sure that the nut on the clamp, like so, is not going to contact the ground. You can see that it's above the bottom of the pipe. And obviously it's above the bottom of the cat. You don't want your band clamps, either the nuts or the where the two ends come together, you don't want that scraping the ground or having the chance of catching anything. You want the lowest part of your system to be your cats. So just make sure nothing's hanging too low or hanging lower than it needs to be. Get all the O2s hooked up. If I didn't say that before, make sure they're firm in their spot. Don't over torque them. Make sure all your wires are out of the way. If not, use your supplied zip ties, or use any zip tie for that matter. But just make sure everything's straight. And that's the last of the header install. So hopefully here soon I'll have a sound clip for you guys and maybe kind of a conclusion video. So that completes the install for the SLP headers onto a bone stock 02 Camaro.